It's a peculiar human tendency, isn't it? This deep-seated need to connect the dots, to find patterns, to impose order on chaos, even when that order is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. Sometimes the search for meaning can take us down paths so convoluted, so far removed from consensus reality, that we lose sight of everything that ever anchored us. That's what brought Michael to me. A man adrift in a sea of his own making, a sea filled with shadows and whispers of hidden agendas, all stemming from what he believed was a profound, undeniable truth that everyone else was simply too blind or perhaps too complicit to see. When Michael first walked onto my stage, or rather, when I first saw him in our pre-interviews, there was a weariness about him that was almost palpable. He was a man of 35, carrying the weight of 55, not just in his slumped shoulders and the deep lines etched around his eyes, but in his spirit. He looked like he'd been fighting a war, and frankly, he had. Not with an external enemy, not in some physical battle, but within himself and against a world that had, by his account, abandoned him. He was articulate, even eloquent, but there was a manic intensity behind his eyes, a glint that spoke of sleepless nights spent poring over digital evidence, connecting dots that, to anyone outside his specific framework, simply didn't connect. The central problem, as he presented it, was simple. He had uncovered a massive global conspiracy, one that threatened the very fabric of society, and in his fervent attempt to warn everyone, he had systematically alienated every single person who cared about him. His family saw him as deluded, his friends called him crazy, and his employer eventually let him go, citing disturbing and disruptive behavior after his increasingly erratic attempts to expose the truth at work. He was, to put it mildly, an outcast. The labels thrown at him were harsh, paranoid, delusional, unstable, a danger to himself and others. And while I never dismiss the very real mental health challenges people face, I also know that sometimes those labels can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, driving someone further into the very corner they're trying to escape. My initial impression of Michael wasn't one of a raving lunatic. It was of a profoundly isolated, deeply hurt individual who had built an elaborate psychological fortress around himself, not to keep others out, but to protect a fragile core that had been bruised and battered by rejection. He wasn't just believing a conspiracy, he was living one, and the cost was everything. His marriage had imploded, his children were being kept from him, and he was living in a sparsely furnished apartment. His once thriving career as a data analyst reduced to a handful of odd jobs that barely kept him afloat. He was a man who had traded his entire tangible life for an intangible belief, and now, standing on the precipice of total collapse, he was looking for someone, anyone, to just listen. Not necessarily to agree, but to truly listen. That in itself was a powerful plea. What struck me most was his conviction. It wasn't just a casual belief, it was the bedrock of his existence. He had poured every ounce of his intellect, his energy, and his resources into validating this particular narrative. And it wasn't just a conspiracy theory, it was the grand unified theory of all conspiracies, an overarching framework that explained everything from geopolitical events to celebrity gossip. This level of investment, I knew, didn't just appear overnight. There's always a backstory, an origin point for such a profound shift in perception. I dug into it gently at first, letting him tell his story without interruption, observing his body language, the flicker in his eyes when certain keywords came up. Michael wasn't born believing in shadow governments and secret societies. He came from a stable, loving family, had a good education, and a promising career. His journey into this rabbit hole, as he described it, began innocently enough with a period of intense personal stress. He'd lost his father unexpectedly, a man he deeply admired, and shortly after, his marriage hit a rough patch. He felt a profound sense of loss, a lack of control, and a pervasive anxiety about the future. It's during such vulnerable times I've observed that people often seek external explanations for internal turmoil. The world suddenly seems more threatening, less predictable, and the human mind, in its infinite complexity, sometimes finds comfort in a narrative that attributes these unsettling feelings to a powerful, hidden force rather than acknowledging the painful, often random realities of life. For Michael, that comfort came in the form of online communities. He stumbled upon a forum, initially seeking support for his grief, but soon found himself exposed to alternative viewpoints on current events. These groups offered a sense of belonging, a shared understanding, and a perceived insider knowledge that felt empowering. They told him that his feelings of unease weren't irrational, they were a rational response to a world being manipulated. They offered him not just answers, but a mission to awaken others. This gave his life purpose again, a purpose that felt far more significant than his day job or even his personal relationships, which coincidentally were already strained. He described how it started slowly with a healthy dose of skepticism, he claimed, but then as he delved deeper, he found evidence, a news report that seemed contradictory, a historical event with unexplained gaps, a scientific consensus that felt too neat. Each piece, when viewed through the lens of the nascent conspiracy, seemed to click into place, forming a coherent, albeit alternative picture. He showed me intricate diagrams he had drawn, connections he'd highlighted, hours of videos he'd watched. It wasn't just about believing, it was about the process of discovering, of feeling like a detective piecing together a grand puzzle that others were too blind to see. The validation he sought from his online peers became a powerful reinforcement loop, creating an echo chamber where his beliefs were constantly affirmed. He wasn't just consuming information, he was creating his own reality, painstakingly constructing a narrative where he was a hero, a truth seeker, fighting against an invisible enemy. Beneath the surface, I saw a man desperately trying to regain control, to find meaning in a chaotic world, and to perhaps unconsciously numb the pain of his personal losses by focusing on a much larger, more encompassing struggle. The conspiracy wasn't just a belief, it was a coping mechanism, a way to channel his anxieties and grief into a framework that made sense, even if that sense was entirely divorced from objective reality. The more isolated he became from his real-world connections, the deeper he dove into this manufactured reality, each rejection from his family and friends serving as further proof that they were either unwitting pawns or part of the cover-up. It was a tragic feedback loop, trapping him tighter with every attempt by loved ones to pull him out. The insidious nature of these beliefs isn't just in what they convince someone to believe, but in how they systematically dismantle real-world relationships. For Michael, his descent into the conspiracy became an all-consuming passion, and that passion inevitably clashed with the realities of his family life. His wife, Sarah, initially tried to be understanding. She saw his grief, his stress, and tried to attribute his new interest to a coping mechanism. But understanding quickly turned to concern, then to frustration, and finally to outright alarm. He started spending less time with her and their children, dedicating almost every waking hour outside of work to his research. His conversations became monologues, invariably circling back to his theories. Dinner table discussions devolved into lectures about globalists and secret cabals. He started questioning everything, from the ingredients in their food to the curriculum in their children's school, all through the lens of his overarching conspiracy. I remember Sarah telling me in a pre-interview how it felt like she was losing him piece by piece. It was like he was still there physically, she said, her voice heavy with sorrow, but his mind, his soul, was somewhere else entirely. He'd look at me, but it was like he was seeing a stranger. Or worse, someone who just wasn't woke enough to understand the truth. This is where the blame shifting truly began. When Sarah or his parents expressed worry, when they tried to gently suggest he was perhaps going too far, Michael didn't hear it as concern. He heard it as an attack. He interpreted their skepticism not as love, but as ignorance or even complicity. You just don't want to see it, do you? He'd accuse, his voice rising. You're comfortable in your ignorance, letting them control you. He dismissed their arguments, not by logically refuting them, but by asserting they were simply sheeple, unable to grasp the real facts he had painstakingly uncovered. This pattern of dismissal and accusation created an unbreachable wall between him and his loved ones. The tensions escalated dramatically when Michael started trying to red pill his own children, showing them videos, explaining his theories in terms inappropriate for their age. Sarah drew a hard line there. That's when the arguments turned explosive. The kind where words become weapons and emotional wounds are inflicted that take years to heal. He accused her of being part of the system, of deliberately keeping their children blind. She accused him of endangering their emotional well-being, of abandoning his responsibilities as a father and husband. His parents, who had always been his staunchest supporters, tried to intervene, suggesting professional help. Michael reacted with outrage, believing they were trying to silence him, to drug him into conformity. He saw their pleas as further proof of the conspiracy's reach, evidence that even his own family was being manipulated or had simply given up their free thought. His behavior at work became increasingly problematic as well. He started sending emails to colleagues, explaining his theories, trying to recruit them. He'd spend work hours researching and posting online, neglecting his duties. When confronted by his manager, he saw it not as a performance review, but as censorship, an attempt to suppress his vital message. He even tried to use company resources to disseminate his findings, which was the final straw. He was fired, a devastating blow that he, predictably, attributed to the very conspiracy he was trying to expose. They want to silence me, he told me, eyes blazing, because I'm getting too close to the truth. The loss of his job, his primary source of income, and a significant part of his identity plunged him into deeper financial and emotional distress, yet it only solidified his conviction. The world was actively working against him, and that, to him, was undeniable proof of his righteousness. This escalation reached its peak when Sarah, after countless attempts to reason with him, after witnessing his emotional decline and the impact it was having on their children, finally left him. She took the kids and moved in with her parents, filing for separation. Michael was devastated, but even then, he couldn't see his beliefs as the root cause. He saw it as another casualty of the war he was fighting, a sacrifice demanded by the truth. He became more isolated, more entrenched, and more desperate for validation. It was his mother, despite their strained relationship, who saw my show as a last resort. She knew he wouldn't listen to them, but perhaps, just perhaps, he would listen to an objective, authoritative voice, someone who could cut through the noise and speak to the man she knew was still in there somewhere. She hoped I could provide a space where he felt heard, without being immediately dismissed, in the hope that once he felt truly heard, he might be open to truly listening himself. She made the call. And that's how Michael ended up on my radar. A man utterly convinced he held the key to universal truth while simultaneously losing everything that made his personal truth worth living. When Michael sat across from me, there was a palpable tension in the air. He was guarded, wary, like a cornered animal, but there was also an eagerness to finally tell his story, to lay out his evidence for someone he perceived as powerful enough to potentially amplify his message. He didn't come to be fixed. He came to be heard, and he hoped to be vindicated. That's a critical distinction to understand when dealing with individuals so deeply immersed in their own narrative. You can't just tell them they're wrong. That only reinforces their belief that you're part of the system or too ignorant to understand. My approach, as always, is to meet them where they are, to establish a foundation of trust and respect, and then, very carefully, to begin to chip away at the walls they've built. Michael, I started my voice steady, and even I've heard a lot about your story. I've read your emails. I've seen some of the material you've put together, and I understand you feel like you've uncovered something monumental, something everyone needs to know about. I watched his posture shift slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that I wasn't immediately dismissive. You've invested a tremendous amount of time, energy, and frankly, sacrificed a lot in your life because of these beliefs. Is that fair to say? He nodded, a tight, defensive nod. It is. It's the truth. And it's cost me everything, but that's what happens when you try to wake people up. And that everything includes your marriage, your children, your career, your relationships with your parents. You're effectively isolated right now, aren't you? I wasn't being accusatory, just stating a fact he couldn't deny. He looked down, a shadow passing over his face. This was the first crack, the first acknowledgement of the very real, very painful consequences of his chosen path. That's part of the sacrifice, he mumbled, still clinging to the narrative. Is it, Michael? Or is it a consequence that perhaps wasn't entirely necessary? Let's talk about the truth for a minute. You believe there's a global conspiracy, a shadow government pulling the strings. You've got charts, diagrams, connections. You spent countless hours researching this. What do you get out of that? What does that give you? He looked up, surprised by the question. What do I get? I get understanding. I get to see the world clearly, not through the lies they feed us. I get to fight for what's right. His voice grew stronger, more animated. And when you fight for what's right, and everyone around you, the people who love you, tell you you're wrong or you're crazy, how does that feel? He bristled. They're just blind. They don't want to see it. It's frustrating, but it just means I have to work harder. But Michael, let's be real here. You're not just losing arguments, you're losing people, you're losing your family, you're losing your ability to provide for yourself. If this truth is so vital, so powerful, why is it costing you so much to share it? And why is it creating such a chasm between you and the people who objectively care about your well-being? This was the confrontation, not about the specifics of his conspiracy theory. Debating those would be a pointless exercise in futility, as he would always find a counter-argument within his framework, but about the cost of his belief system. I wasn't challenging his facts. I was challenging the functionality of his life, because they're conditioned. They're programmed, he argued, raising his voice, his hands gesticulating. They're part of the problem. Are they Michael? Or are they just trying to connect with the man they love, the man who was once a loving husband and father? Do you think Sarah left you because she hates the truth you uncovered, or because the man she married became unrecognizable, consumed by something she couldn't reach? I paused, letting that sink in. Think about your children. When you show them these videos, these disturbing images, These complex theories, do you think they're processing it as truth or as their dad becoming increasingly scary and unpredictable? His face went pale. That hit home. He flinched, his eyes darting away. He didn't have an immediate answer. And that silence, that rare moment of introspection, was the breakthrough I was looking for. It wasn't about proving him wrong on a global scale. It was about connecting him back to the very personal, very human consequences of his choices. He had built this elaborate intellectual framework to make sense of the world, but in doing so, he had systematically dismantled the emotional framework of his own life. The goal wasn't to shatter his beliefs in one fell swoop, but to introduce doubt not about the existence of conspiracies, but about the utility of his particular belief system in his own life. I needed him to see that while he was chasing shadows, his actual life was crumbling and his children were losing their father. That's a truth even the most entrenched individual struggles to deny. The silence in the room stretched thick with Michael's internal struggle. He was visibly shaken, no longer animated by the defensive fervor that usually accompanied his discussions about the conspiracy. It was as if the elaborate mental scaffolding he'd constructed was momentarily wobbling, not from an attack on its structural integrity, but from the sudden, stark realization of the emptiness it had created beneath him. This was the moment. The breakthrough isn't about winning an argument, it's about creating a space for an individual to truly feel the impact of their choices, to see beyond the intellectual justifications and connect with the raw, emotional cost. Michael, I continued, my voice softer now but still firm. You've painted a picture for me of a world that is inherently controlled, dangerous, and deceptive. And you feel it's your job to expose that. I get that. But let me ask you something. If you truly believe the world is this dark, this manipulated, this dangerous, what does that mean for your children? What kind of future are you trying to build for them by showing them this darkest version of reality? Do you want them to live in constant fear, constantly looking over their shoulders, forever suspicious of everyone and everything? He looked up, his eyes wide, a flicker of genuine fear, not for the world, but for his kids. No, he whispered, almost imperceptibly. Of course not. Then what are you doing? Because from where I sit, and more importantly from where your wife and parents sit, you're not protecting them, you're isolating them. You're not empowering them, you're terrifying them. And you're doing it by pushing away the very people who could help you, who could support you, who could be a source of strength in a world you already perceive as hostile. I leaned forward, my tone empathetic but unyielding. You talk about truth. Let's talk about your truth, Michael. The truth that you lost your father and that hurt. The truth that your marriage was struggling and that scared you. The truth that you felt a deep sense of powerlessness and you found power in knowing something others didn't. Is there any truth to that? He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on some point beyond me, as if seeing a reflection of himself he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. I just wanted to understand, he said, his voice cracking. I felt so lost after my dad. Everything felt out of control. And then this made sense. It gave me something to focus on. The defenses were truly crumbling now, revealing the vulnerable, grieving man beneath the layers of intellectualized anger and conviction. This wasn't about the conspiracy anymore. It was about the pain that had paved the way for it. And it gave you a way to feel powerful, didn't it? To feel like you had answers when life felt overwhelming and answerless. But Michael, that power came at an enormous cost. It cost you the very people who could offer you genuine comfort and support during those difficult times. It cost you the trust of your family. It cost you your own stability. You traded real, tangible connections for an abstract sense of enlightenment. He started to cry, silent tears tracing paths down his worn cheeks. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he choked out. I just wanted to make sense of things. I wanted to protect them. I believe you did, I affirmed, and that's important. But the path you took, the methods you employed, they ultimately did the opposite. They alienated the very people you wanted to protect. And now you're sitting here alone with a truth that has cost you everything and a family that is hurting and afraid, not of the conspiracy, but of losing you entirely. This was the core of it. The realization that his pursuit of an external truth had blinded him to the internal, emotional truths that were devastating his life. We spent the rest of the session and subsequent discussions not dissecting the validity of his beliefs, but exploring the function of those beliefs in his life. What void were they filling? What pain were they masking? How were they serving as a protective shield against the difficult, messy realities of human existence? The breakthrough wasn't a sudden, complete abandonment of his theories, but a shift in perspective. It was the moment he started to question not what he believed, but why he believed it so fiercely and at such a catastrophic personal price. He began to see that his theories, far from liberating him, had become a prison, isolating him from the very connections he deep down desperately craved. That was the first step, the truly significant one, towards reclaiming his life. The path from breakthrough to actual change is rarely a straight line, especially when deeply ingrained belief systems are involved. For Michael, that initial emotional release on my stage was crucial, a crack in the dam, but it wasn't a complete demolition. He left that day with a new awareness, a raw, undeniable understanding of the profound personal cost of his journey. But understanding is one thing. Enacting change, facing the world without the psychological shield of a grand narrative is another entirely. The immediate outcome of our first few sessions was a commitment from Michael to engage in therapy. This wasn't about curing him of his conspiracy beliefs in a single stroke, but about providing him with tools to address the underlying vulnerabilities and anxieties that had made him so susceptible to them in the first place. My team worked to connect him with a therapist who specialized in grief, trauma, and cognitive behavioral therapy, someone who understood the complexities of such belief systems without being immediately dismissive. Crucially, the focus was shifted from debating the facts of his conspiracy to examining its function in his life. The goal was to help him build healthier coping mechanisms for stress, grief, and feelings of powerlessness, and to reestablish a sense of agency within his actual life rather than in an imagined battle against an invisible enemy. I also facilitated a meeting, albeit a carefully managed one, between Michael and Sarah. This wasn't about reconciliation in the immediate sense, but about creating a space for honest, unaccused communication. Sarah, still guarded and deeply hurt, listened as Michael, for the first time, expressed genuine remorse for the pain he had caused, acknowledging the impact of his behavior on her and the children without immediately diverting to his theories. He didn't abandon his beliefs on the spot. That would have been unrealistic and frankly disingenuous. But he did acknowledge that his actions stemming from those beliefs had been destructive and had cost him what he held most dear. I see now, he told her, his voice quiet, that I pushed you away when I needed you most. And I'm sorry for how scared I made you and the kids. That simple statement, devoid of blame or justification, was monumental. It opened a tiny door, not to forgiveness necessarily, but to the possibility of future dialogue. The process of change for Michael was and continues to be a journey of small, often painful steps. He didn't wake up one morning and declare himself free of all his previous convictions. What happened was more nuanced. He started to re-engage with his family, tentatively at first, agreeing to supervise visits with his children, where the conversation was strictly about their lives, their school, their interests, and not about global conspiracies. He started looking for a new job, focusing on regaining financial stability, a concrete step towards rebuilding his life in the real world. He began to question the sources of his information more critically, not because I told him to, but because he was starting to develop a healthier sense of skepticism, directed not just outward, but inward, at his own motivations and thought processes. He started asking himself, is this truly helping me, or is it taking me further away from what I value? The outcome for Michael is still evolving, an open-ended chapter rather than a neatly tied bow. He hasn't fully shed every single one of his long-held conspiracy beliefs. Some ideas, deeply ingrained over years, are incredibly difficult to dislodge. However, his relationship to those beliefs has fundamentally changed. They no longer consume him. They no longer dictate his every action, nor do they serve as the sole lens through which he views the world. He's learning to compartmentalize, to recognize that while he might still harbor certain suspicions about external events, those suspicions do not define his identity, nor do they justify the destruction of his personal life. He's found a middle ground, a way to navigate a complex world without sacrificing his own well-being or the well-being of his loved ones. He's rebuilding trust, slowly, painfully. His parents are back in his life, and he's working towards a more stable co-parenting relationship with Sarah. He's found a new, less stressful job that provides a sense of routine and purpose. The intense, manic glint in his eyes has softened, replaced by a weary but hopeful determination. He understands now that while he might never convince the world of his truth, his most important truth lies in the connections he makes, the love he shares, and the life he actively creates, rather than one he passively watches unravel. It's a pragmatic, deeply human outcome. He came to me having lost everything because of a belief system. He's now working to regain everything by finding a more grounded, compassionate way to exist, recognizing that the greatest conspiracy of all is often the one we weave around ourselves, isolating us from the very reality that holds the promise of healing and connection. Watching Michael's journey unfold was a powerful reminder that people often cling to narratives not because they are inherently malicious or even necessarily irrational in their own internal logic, but because those narratives serve a deeper psychological purpose. For Michael, his elaborate conspiracy theory became a shield, a sword, and a compass all rolled into one. It provided him with an explanation for the chaotic world, a sense of agency in the face of powerlessness, and a ready-made community when his real-world connections began to fray. Dislodging such a central construct isn't just about presenting counter-evidence, it's about understanding and addressing the underlying needs that the construct fulfills. In our continuing conversations, even after his initial breakthroughs, I noticed that moments of relapse or regression often coincided with periods of increased stress or uncertainty in his life. He would find himself drawn back to his old online forums, to the familiar, comforting echo chamber, when he felt overwhelmed by the practical challenges of rebuilding his life. A difficult meeting with Sarah, a setback at his new job, or even just a particularly bad day. This highlighted a crucial point. These belief systems aren't just intellectual, they are deeply emotional and behavioral. They become deeply entrenched coping mechanisms. My ongoing role, and the role of his therapist, became less about dismantling the conspiracy itself and more about helping Michael develop healthier, more adaptive coping strategies for life's inevitable stressors. It was about equipping him with the emotional resilience to face uncertainty without immediately retreating into the familiar, albeit destructive, certainty of his chosen narrative. We talked extensively about the concept of locus of control. For a long time, Michael had an external locus of control. Everything bad that happened, every struggle, was attributed to the shadowy figures orchestrating the conspiracy. This relieved him of personal responsibility for his circumstances, but it also made him feel powerless to change anything. Part of his therapeutic journey was to gradually shift that locus inward, to recognize that while there are indeed things outside of our control in the world, there is also immense power in how we choose to respond, how we choose to build our own lives, and how we choose to cultivate our relationships. This meant taking ownership of his actions, acknowledging his role in the breakdown of his marriage and family relationships, and accepting that while external forces might exist, his personal happiness and well-being were ultimately his responsibility to cultivate. This was a particularly challenging phase for Michael because it meant grieving not just the loss of his family life, but also the loss of his perceived purpose as a truth seeker and the loss of the intellectual framework that had given him such a profound, albeit false, sense of understanding. It meant confronting the uncomfortable reality that he had traded real, tangible love and connection for an abstract crusade. It meant facing the deep loneliness that had been masked by the constant vigilance of his research. These are not easy truths to swallow, and there were days when he questioned whether the pain of facing reality was worth it. He'd sometimes express doubt, wondering if he was giving up or selling out by re-engaging with mainstream life. Michael, I remember telling him, there's a fundamental difference between engaging with the world with a healthy degree of skepticism and withdrawing from it entirely out of paranoia. One allows you to be an informed, active participant in your own life and in society. The other turns you into a passive victim, constantly reacting to perceived threats and losing sight of the good that still exists, the good that you can still create. We explored the idea that genuine strength isn't found in fighting an invisible enemy, but in building a meaningful, resilient life in the face of life's inherent uncertainties. It was about finding purpose not in uncovering what's hidden, but in actively cultivating what is present and real, his children, his health, his potential for positive contribution. His progress wasn't linear. There were ups and downs, moments of doubt, and occasional slips back into old patterns of thought. But what emerged was a consistent, albeit slow, trajectory towards greater self-awareness and personal responsibility. He began to report feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years, a quiet calm that replaced the frantic energy of constant vigilance. He started listening more to others, truly hearing their perspectives rather than just waiting for his turn to inject his own narrative. His conversations with Sarah became less about past grievances and more about the practicalities of co-parenting and eventually a tentative exploration of what a civil, respectful relationship might look like moving forward. It wasn't about a dramatic, instantaneous cure, but about the steady, hard work of rebuilding a life, one thoughtful, intentional choice at a time. The story of Michael is a testament to the powerful hold of belief, but also to the profound human capacity for growth and the potential for even the most entrenched individuals to find their way back to themselves and their loved ones if given the right tools and a compassionate yet firm hand to guide them. The most challenging aspect of working with someone like Michael isn't just about helping them challenge their beliefs, it's about helping them rebuild their identity. For so long, his identity had been inextricably linked to being the truth teller, the one who saw through the lies, the one fighting the good fight. When you start to peel away that layer, you leave a void. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. It was crucial, therefore, that as he began to step back from the all-consuming nature of his conspiracy theories, he also started to discover and cultivate other aspects of himself, other sources of meaning and purpose. We talked a lot about what truly matters to him beyond the abstract ideals of truth and justice as defined by his conspiracy. He spoke of the joy he used to get from playing guitar, a hobby he had abandoned years ago. He reminisced about coaching his son's Little League team, a simple pleasure that had been eclipsed by his research. These weren't grand revelations, but they were deeply personal touchstones that connected him back to the man he was before the theories took over. We encouraged him to pick up the guitar again, to volunteer at his son's school if Sarah approved, to find small, tangible ways to re-engage with the world and with the parts of himself that had been neglected. This wasn't about distraction, it was about repopulating his inner landscape with healthier, more life-affirming sources of self-worth and satisfaction. One particular turning point came during a session where we were discussing the concept of legacy. I asked him, Michael, when your children grow up, what do you want them to remember about their father? Do you want them to remember a man consumed by fear and suspicion, alienated from his family, constantly fighting an invisible battle? Or do you want them to remember a father who was present, who was loving, who taught them resilience, who contributed positively to their lives? The question hung in the air, a stark contrast to the abstract battles he had been fighting. He confessed that the thought of his children remembering him as the crazy dad was a profound source of shame and regret, a pain far more visceral than any perceived global injustice. That was a powerful motivator. It helped him to reprioritize. The abstract, distant goal of saving the world began to recede in importance compared to the concrete, immediate goal of saving my relationship with my kids. The support system around him also evolved. Sarah, seeing his genuine efforts and the consistent engagement with therapy, started to soften. While reconciliation of their marriage wasn't on the table immediately, they began to forge a new, more respectful co-parenting relationship. This meant clearer boundaries, open communication, and a shared focus on their children's well-being. His parents, who had been heartbroken by his withdrawal, cautiously welcomed him back into their lives, offering emotional support without condoning his past behavior. This renewed connection, while still fragile, provided a vital buffer against the isolation that had so effectively fueled his earlier descent. He was no longer truly alone, battling the world from a digital bunker. He had real, tangible people in his corner, people who loved him, not for his theories. Michael's story is a testament to the powerful, often hidden, drivers behind complex belief systems. It's not simply about what someone believes, but why they believe it and what psychological function that belief serves. My role, as I see it, isn't to judge or to simply tell someone they're wrong, but to understand the terrain of their inner world, to help them connect their beliefs to their behaviors, and to guide them towards choices that are ultimately more life-affirming, more connecting, and more authentically true to who they want to be. Michael found his way back, not by having his beliefs shattered, but by gradually, painstakingly choosing to prioritize his real life over his perceived truth. He learned that true strength isn't about rigid adherence to a narrative, but about the courage to adapt, to grow, and to embrace the messy, imperfect, yet profoundly beautiful reality of human connection. He's still got a long way to go, as we all do, but he's walking that path now with his eyes wide open and his heart slowly mending.